Today is our initial thoughts and opinions of the ZTMoto Phantom 85, a true 85cc motorized bike kit with a 52mm piston and of course a 40mm stroke. Look forward to a full review of this kit in the future after we've had some time to play around with it and I've had some time to heal. In my defense, I wasn't trying to pop a wheelie, I was just enjoying some full throttle blips and a little lifting of the front tire. I guess I got a little carried away. With that being said, you should really respect the power this motor has to offer. Don't get me wrong, it's not an absolute monster, and if you've ridden dirt bikes your whole life, you'll be fine. But if all you're used to is the standard China doll motors, and even the YD100, this will steal your bike if you let it. Starting with our shopping experience, we ordered this from bicycleengines.com on a Sunday night. It arrived the following Friday morning, so shipping time is fine in my opinion. Nice thing about bicycleengines.com is when you order kits from them, they give you 3 different sprocket options. I chose the 36. Now that's not the one you saw in the video because I did a motor swap. We're testing this with the 44 tooth sprocket, but I do plan on using the 36, so I figured I might as well just go ahead and order it. There's 36, 44, and I believe 48 as your 3 sprocket options. If you get the 48, be careful because it will lift the front tire pretty much every time you hit the throttle, as it was almost doing that with the 44, and I wasn't even going full throttle most of the time, so there's that. 36 is probably going to be the best option for the majority of users. Interestingly enough, 2 days after I ordered this kit on an unrelated email address, I was sent an offer to review this kit for free on my LA Hover email address. I declined the offer, though I did tell them I was grateful, and I asked a few questions. We'll get into that in a moment, as I wanted to give you guys an unbiased review, so I paid for this with my own money. While I had their attention in an email, I decided to ask them if they planned on having any bolt-on expansion chambers for this kit in the future, as I felt it would open this kit up to the more hardcore enthusiast. They said that due to COVID, this entire project had been delayed a year, but if there was enough interest in aftermarket parts for this motor, they would definitely consider it. So it wasn't a yes or a no, but they're definitely listening, so make sure you get your voice out there, send them some emails, as expansion chambers for this kit would be really nice. But with that being said, the stock exhaust that comes with this thing is really impressive. The build quality is fantastic. It's a beautiful exhaust. Now it's just a muffler, no expansion chamber, so we're probably not getting any performance out of it, but the piping is massive. The welds are beautiful. I did notice though on mine it did not have the support tab that Alex got with his kit. Interesting. This is a bit heavier than a standard China doll exhaust, so a support tab on this one would be justified, as I never actually used any kind of supporting with the China doll exhaust systems. Running down the list of a few of the upgrades and accessories that come with this kit, you get a high-performance speed carburetor. It's the Bafang model, but I assume this is upjetted quite massively for this particular kit. It definitely feels like it keeps up with the motor. Me, it might be a little rich, but I'm almost at sea level, so that makes sense. It comes with its own dedicated reed valve. It's similar to the CDH CNC one you would find on like Amazon, but this one is a cast aluminum build. I have no issues with it. It seems fine and it looks good. The port matching is nice. You get a ceramic lined cylinder, which is supposed to be good for durability and help a little bit with performance. We'll be able to test that more in the future to find out if it is truly durable. It claims to have a high-performance CDI. I have no way of telling whether this is true, but they say it has Yamaha components in it, so that would be nice. It does feel a little bit lighter than some of the other ones I've used, so there's definitely something different going on here. It also claims to have a performance magneto. Once again, I have no way of telling you this. It is the 3-wire version, and what I've seen in the past, the 3-wire versions are usually not the high-voltage ones, but I could be completely wrong about that, so don't take my word for it. This also comes with the improved gas cap, which should be more resistant to leaking at high throttle with a full tank, which is common on the cheapy kits. It also claims to have a stuffed case. Now there is something interesting about this that might make that redundant, and we'll get to it later. And then the grips look upgraded. They appear to have a stronger material, so they're less likely to break when you're pulling on the throttle. Their description also says this is a more balanced crank, and it does feel pretty smooth, which is nice considering it's a larger bore kit, and it feels like it's running a little rich. Rich motors tend to run rough, and they can fool you into thinking the crank is unbalanced. So with those two things combined, I will believe that this crank is a better balance than most kits. Maybe not perfect, but it's relatively smooth. There are a few other upgrades you can check out on their website in the description for this motor, but those are the most notables I've seen so far. Now on to what most of you are here for, the motor itself. Starting with the bottom end, as far as I can tell, this is a YD100 through and through. I haven't completely torn it apart, so if there are any modifications inside the case, I can't tell for sure. But as far as I can see, if they ever make this cylinder kit aftermarket, then YD100 owners would have a massive bolt-on performance enhancement with one of these cylinder kits. For the cylinder, there's been a lot of back and forth in the comments and on the Discord server about what this thing really is. Now, it's obvious that they've copied a design of something like an MS460, but not to the letter. This is specifically casted for a motorized bike engine. The intake is casted for a 40mm stud pattern and a reed valve. The exhaust is casted for its own dedicated exhaust system. I see most of the, well, probably all of the MS460s have a square exhaust port. This one is round. I don't know if the stud pattern is different. This casting has wings, I'll call them, that cover the case's old transfers that are no longer used. See, this cylinder and piston combination has its own transfer circuit, so the old transfers in the case are just an empty void. We'll get into that more in a moment. And as far as I can tell, that's the most notable changes. Now, I believe the stud pattern is also designed for the YD100, but you guys with the MS460 mods can tell me if the stud pattern is different on the chainsaw motors. Does it require like filling the holes and tapping your own spacing? I don't know if you have to space the MS460s, but with this one, it's just designed for the 40mm stroke. Mine does have two base gaskets and a quite large squish band. I think it's over 1mm, so I could probably drop one of the base gaskets for a tighter squish onto the piston. As far as I can tell, it's an exact MS460 piston. I don't have one to put side by side. The only difference I can see is that this one is windowed. This kit has to use a reed valve, otherwise the intake and exhaust ports would crosstalk with each other, but that is a good thing because it means with the reed valve they had more freedom to work with port timings, which would probably explain why this thing's such a torquey little beast. You'll notice that the piston isn't similar to anything you've seen on most of the China dolls, as this one has cutouts on the side, and that is there because the piston itself, along with the cylinder, works as their own independent transfer circuit. The bottom of the piston acts as a floor to the transfer routing. There's probably a more technical way to talk about that, but that's what I've noticed. Now about case stuffing and these little wings on the bottom of the cylinder that cover the old transfer ports on the case. So the transfer ports on the case are no longer used for anything. They're just an empty void. The wings on the cylinder are just there to seal the case, nothing else. If they were going to stuff the case to improve performance, you think that would be redundant considering they just left the old transfer voids. Now you might be able to play around with this by filling these with something like JB Weld to decrease case volume. I don't know if case volume is carefully taken into consideration with this kit, so that might help or hurt your performance. An easy experiment and reversible if you don't like the results. We'll probably play around with that in the future. But I bring this up because if they were going to stuff the case, why leave the transfer voids? Anyways, moving on. A few compliments and complaints about initial inspection. The quality of hardware in this kit looks fine. The case itself has a beautiful casting with no junk anywhere in the cylinder or the case, as far as I can see. Unfortunately, they didn't grease the bevel gears or the clutch cam, and they only put a very light amount of grease on the bucking bar. This is common in most kits, so I'm not too worried about it. We'll cover this ourselves. My big concern is that, of course, as always, they didn't grease the crank seals during installation, and I can see a small amount of shaved rubber around the crank by the seals. It's only a very small amount, not as bad as I've seen on a lot of kits, so no big deal. And the motor's running just fine, so obviously we're not having any air leaks. But this is still just a complaint I've had for a while. One thing I would like to point out with one of the accessories that come with the kit, just in case anybody important is listening, the chain tensioner. Now it is a 4-bolt style with the slanted adjustment, which is nice. I like to see that. Unfortunately, the slant moves towards the motor, not the sprocket. Having a slant move towards the sprocket means that any adjustments you make on the pulley have a more significant impact on chain tension. And on some builds, this is important because you don't have a lot of freedom to work with. The slant moving towards the engine means that as you raise the pulley, it's actually moving it away from the sprocket, so your tension adjustments are not as amplified. This will make sense if you've ever had to deal with it. Now this motor is destined for its own dedicated bike, but for now, I'm just putting it on my daily driver as a motor swap. We're also swapping the CDI so we can make sure that everything included with the kit that can affect performance will be on the bike. This particular frame is a Kent Bayside, and the Bayside has a very large down tube. Now this kit comes with the large 40mm lower mount and 8mm mounting studs, but with this particular frame, no matter what motor you put on it, you have to use a universal adapter. In my situation, I'm going to use this extended adapter that I purchased off Amazon, link in the description, simply because it puts less stress on the frame and provides a more secure mounting point. For our first startup, with choke, the motor fired right up, died, turned off the choke, and it fired right back up and stayed running. After a quick adjustment to the idle, we were off to test the bike for the first time. During break-in, with about a 25-to-1 mix, because I didn't have a manual with this motor, so I wasn't sure what to use for break-in. I'm sure 25-to-1 is probably too much oil, but that's what we're using as our first tank. And with that, this thing has performance right out the gate. Break-in with this is probably going to be about 1 tank. Then I'll be running 32-to-1 for the rest of its life, unless I see any reason to change it to a different ratio. Our 2 biggest observations during our first few rides, but first, make sure you guys subscribe if you want to see more about this motor, because we're going to let you know every little detail we find out about it as we get more experience with it. Now, during our first ride, I noticed this thing has a lot of power. Now, we've said that throughout the video a few times, but I'm not kidding. This thing is a night and day difference compared to any other stock or modified motor I've put on a bike so far. And I'm really curious, if any of you guys that have done the chainsaw cylinder swaps ends up testing one of these kits, let me know if the performance is less, the same, or better than any of the work you've personally done during those modifications, as your input would be very valuable. Performance aside, this thing likes to pull, but what I mean is it only likes to pull. This motor, at least during the break-in period and with the stock carburetor tuning, only likes to pull. Once you start cruising and you take the load off the motor, it starts 4-stroking like crazy and gets very loud. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing if you're looking for all-out performance, but if you're looking for a cruiser motor, it's definitely something to consider. Now, don't just take that as your decision whether or not this is the right motor for you, because during the break-in period, motors run a lot different. And I can drop the needle a little bit to lean this thing out and hopefully get a more stable cruising bike. But at the moment, anytime you let off the throttle for a cruising speed of about 30 miles an hour, you're going to know it. The motor is just going to start 4-stroking. But as soon as you give it any throttle and put any load on the motor, it smooths out like butter and pulls with every cycle, firing perfectly. And it sounds amazing. It also idles really well, and listening to the tap 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 of the reed valve is something I enjoy quite a bit. So here's some ride footage, and until next time, ride safe.